Okay, so welcome to today's discussion on the Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers, sponsored by the Principles of Freedom Foundation. The purpose of this foundation is to provide a platform for discussing the ideas pertaining to freedom, just as was done in the town squares, churches, and taverns during the founding era of this nation. Ideally, those who listen to or participate in this discussion will have come prepared by having read the materials to discuss today. Participating in today's discussion is David Bishop, Laura McDade, Abby Bowman, Leah Hone, Tiffany Mason, Tyler Mason, Derek Harris, Juliet Bellinger, and me, Brooklyn McClure. We hope you will continue to participate in the discussion of freedom, even beyond this podcast, by commenting on our Facebook group, YouTube channel, and most importantly, by having dialogue with your own family and neighbors. So let's get started with today's discussion. We have read the first 6 Federalist Papers and also the first Anti-Federalist paper by Brutus and by Dewitt. So let's just open this up for discussion. What stood out to you most significantly during these readings?
One of the big things that I noticed Hamilton talked a lot about in the Federalist Papers was this concept of safety. And I think that could be a fun one to start out our conversation on, because what freedoms do you give up in the name of safety? So before I give my thoughts, that's just something that stood out to me. So I'm curious, what did y'all think as you were reading through the Federalist Papers and you saw the word safety come up as often as it does in those first 6?
I thought, Tyler, the thought came to mind that this is an instruction booklet for our enemies to know how to destroy our nation and to take away that safety. That's what came to my mind a lot. I'm like, well, you know, it seems like maybe some of our adversaries have been reading the Federalist Papers and thinking, how can we dismantle this nation or dismantle this union or take away their safety? Because as it discussed, like how to protect us or how to keep our safety, I thought, you know what, that shows people exactly where we can also be weak if we are not strengthening these things.
Yeah, Leah, that reminds me of today, Leah and I taught the youth, the teenagers in a Key Liberty class. And we discussed, you know, to what degree you give up freedom for safety, right? And I was actually reminded of Karl Marx. Reading the Communist Manifesto was actually really surprising to me, and how much he talks about safety and also freedom from suffering. That's the #1 goal of the communist regime, right? And so when we start to hear that as being the primary goal, it sounds good, right? It sounds appealing, but you're right, Tyler, like there's a fine line, and that's why our Constitution is actually really short, because the federal government was there to protect you know, national borders, general safety, general welfare, right? Not even specific welfare, in order to keep it at bay. And you were really, who was it that said, here, we give you a republic? Because it really takes personal responsibility. But what were your ideas, Tyler?
A lot along the same lines that, you know, I have no issue with a government that's there to protect what's within their stewardship, right? Like you mentioned, our national borders. Make sure that we're not being invaded by our enemies, or giving up collectively. But when you start meddling into, well, you can't do this because it impedes on the safety of that person, then it starts to become really ticky-tacky, and you start to see a lot of problems with, well, why is my freedom less valuable than your safety, right? And I was talking with Tiffany about this. If you're not familiar with Mike Rowe's lecture, Safety Third, I would strongly recommend go and listen to Safety Third, because we've run this view of safety first. And in a nutshell, what that states is my safety is no longer my responsibility. It is now the responsibility of somebody else. It's my company. It's the store that I'm at. It's the police officer. It's whatever, right? I am absolved of responsibility for my own personal safety. And so seeing that come up as often as it did in these Federalist Papers, that was one of the big things that stood out to me. Like, okay, there's certain aspects of, I think, where he got it right, and others where it's a very slippery slope where, oh, now I don't have to worry about it because the government will take care of my safety, when that really should be people's primary self-concern and not allowing somebody else to have that responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, Tyler. And I think you hit it the nail right on the head when you're talking about, it depends stewardship. So yes, when you're talking about, the general protection of the country, it's a necessary conversation to have. There has to be something in place. But it very much reminded, and Brooke, you mentioned it by mentioning the Communist Manifesto. It reminded me of a friend who, her husband's from Cuba, and they went to visit family there several years ago. And it was very interesting as they visited family members to hear the narrative that was constantly given to them, and everything was centered around safety. It was this fear that was given to them about, this is to protect you, this is your protection. And also this idea of what the United States was, like this very distorted view of that we were in this very dangerous situation. And this was, probably six or 7 years ago. So it was really interesting how that, like you said, it can be a very slippery slope between, okay, this is what we need to protect our country, versus now where it's going to be used as a tool of manipulation for the individual.
Okay, so let's go there. Is freedom dangerous? Because that's pretty much what we're saying is, oh, don't give people too much freedom, and you're fearing because this XYZ could happen, right? If you give people too much freedom.
Yeah, of course it's dangerous. But that's how we learn. Like how we have to be good stewards of that freedom. If there wasn't a danger to it, then we wouldn't have to be careful with our freedom. We wouldn't have a reverence for it.
Yeah, consider the saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And I bring that up because safety is a very dangerous thing. To allow independent minds to be able to decide for themselves, this is how I want to act, this is what I want to do. So you get somebody who comes and says, well, all that freedom is dangerous, so I'm now going to restrict that freedom. And what is it you suddenly have? You've got a Mussolini, you've got a Hitler, you've got a Stalin, you've got a Mao, you've got, right? All of these were born out of people saying, whoa, all this freedom is a dangerous thing. We need to restrict that. And then suddenly you have nothing, which is far more dangerous. But like Brooke said at the beginning, it kind of sounds appealing at first, the way that things can be worded and phrased such that, oh, well, yeah, that's one less thing for me to worry about, or one less thing for me to have to handle or deal with if they just do it for me.
Mm-hmm. And there's maybe this false notion that they doing it for you, dangerous. and that's where the falseness lies, right? And Brutus, so he's the Anti-Federalist, says this, when the people once part with power, they seldom or never resume it again, but by force. So once you've given that power, in the least, to a government, they aren't usually very beneficial in handing that power back to you after the crisis is averted, right? except by force. So that's the danger of being taken care of, but by government in a wholesale way. Okay, was there anything else that stood out to anybody during these readings?
Moderation.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick comment. I lived for 5 years in Hungary, starting up a new facility. And it was interesting because I learned as I was hiring new people, essentially those who were brought up in the communist area, I couldn't hire them. They were so full of fear and kind of felt everyone was out to get them. So it was very interesting. And then I also lived a couple years in France, and the effects of the revolution and the ideas with that are still pervasive. So it ends up impacting all of culture and even what one can do and fear. So there's a dramatic impact on this idea of safety, but safety was so far in Hungary, it was, okay, what job can you have? And in fact, older people didn't really like the new system because they're like, well, I may not have a job. And that wasn't taken for me. So the safety can go to very, very far extent. It was interesting to be around that and feel that as an impact on just a day-to-day, how people worked and thought.
Thanks
jump in for a second?
Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Are you familiar with the invasion of Hungary in 1956 by the Soviet Union without the support of the United States? I believe it was 1956. So that would have been the administration that President Benson was sitting in the cabinet of, and he's very acutely aware of how horrible that was. I don't know why that piece of history was missing from me. I just discovered that last year, and we dropped the ball. We could have come in and helped them. They had freedom fighters, and the communists, the Hungarian communists, were pushed out, and they celebrated, and they held on to it for a very short period of time, and then Russian tanks came in, rolled in, and slaughtered them, and we stood by and did nothing. I don't know why I point that out, other than the fact that maybe it can happen to us. I don't know. I know that we're a much more powerful nation, but I wanted to comment on the dangerous question of, is freedom dangerous? I would add to that, is the lack of freedom dangerous? Which one's more dangerous? And why is freedom dangerous? Freedom, if it's not propped up by morality, isn't freedom, and it will be gone. So freedom is dangerous because we, just like the individual, sovereign individual is dangerous, or should be dangerous, because if you're not, then you're a victim. If you don't have the right to protect yourself, with the threat of danger upon a perpetrator, they will have no problem taking advantage of you because you're not dangerous enough, and so they're going to take you out. And so in that sense, yes, we need to be dangerous. We need to be dangerous individuals, but it needs to be propped up by morality.
That actually brings up a point that Tiffany and I, my wife and I, were talking about, because morality is something that comes up a lot, at least in our conversations while we talk about these things, right? The idea of having a centralized government at all to be there to protect our freedoms and our rights, and knowing where those boundaries are, requires a moral people and a moral government. But who decides what's moral? As a society, where does that come from? I mean, we can point to the Christian view and belief, as I believe that we should, that morality comes from God. But what happens when you have a godless society? What then is moral? And I think that even in itself can be a very dangerous thing to say, well, it's a moral issue. So any thoughts for anybody on that as we start talking about morality? And Brooke, if you need to shift directions to something else that you've got, I mean, feel free to do so. But that was a good correlation with the conversation we'd had this week.
No, I agree, and that's the direction that I felt this discussion should shift to, because especially when you're discussing where is the line that we draw, with regard to how much freedom to give up for safety, etc., it all has to be based on a common morality and a common understanding of principles, right? That's something that we were talking about with some friends today before this call, was that we're kind of at the same challenge right now that the founding fathers were with regard to the risk of their liberties being lost. We're there, we're at the cliff again. But what they had going for them, and which we don't have going for us, and which is why we have maybe a stronger fight, is that they had a common basis of morality. They all believed in the Bible, they all read the Bible, they were all familiar with it. In fact, the account of Moses and his father-in-law Jethro is very much has influenced how our Constitution was created. So it was almost easier, at least, to appeal in the Federalist Papers and these Anti-Federalist Papers, which were newspaper articles that the common people read in order to support or not support the ratification of the Constitution. And so what do we do in a society right now where there's not a common morality, where people don't even believe in God a lot of the times? Where do we go from here? Any thoughts?
Well, Brooke, I just wanted to point out this was definitely something that stood out to me, because several of both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists made assumptions based on a common background or certain common beliefs. I even jotted down in the first essay by John Dewitt, he was talking about the civil society, which I think is very pertinent right now, and he talked about the education of every child in this country tends to promote it. And if you think about at that time, like you said, I mean, many children at that time were being educated in the home, and certainly, every home had a Bible. This was the basic core book of the home, and those were the values that were promoted. Certainly, we're blessed in our country for its diversity, and certainly I don't think our founding fathers had any idea of the level of diversity we were going to achieve down the road. However, we just can't make those same assumptions anymore, and I think like you said, it adds another layer of challenge to where we are in the threat of our freedoms, because we're just not. I don't know how. This is actually something I wanted to bring up. Like, how do we come to a common ground, without forcing beliefs on other people, but coming to, some sort of common ground.
Mm-hmm. A good point, Julia.
Well, I think the problem now is, I think so often you hear like, well, this is where our country's getting confused. True. They're saying no. Really, it's their paradigm. It's their paradigm saying not difference between truth and paradigm. And we're getting confused in our country based off of our experiences. Our paradigm might be, can you guys hear me? Sorry. Based off of our experiences, our paradigm is different, but we can't change truth. Truth is eternal, and that's where we're getting confused.
Okay, so truth is truth. What do you say to people who would argue that, though? Like, no, I have my truth and you have your truth.
I think that I've had this conversation with the youth a lot, and when we talk about natural law, but I think that, I mean, you can talk about like your truth versus my truth. You can talk about natural law. To me, it comes into consequences. Your actions are going to have consequences, and that proves the natural law. But I think when we talk about the morality, we're so far gone from that, where we are on so many different levels as a people and so many different spectrums of what morality is. We have to talk now, like we have to find verbiage that's going to speak to everyone. And I think instead of morality, since that immediately has a religious connotation to it, when you talk about humanity, you know, what, like, people can all come together and agree on what's humane, what humanity means, and that speaks to the soul of who we are. It can speak to the natural law because we have a spirit given to us by a God, you know, and there's certain things that no matter what you do, because there is this core truth, we can't argue on that basis with people who don't believe truth or think they have different truth or understanding of truth. But my kids, but we can talk about humanity and actions and consequences and agree on those sort of reactions, and try to meet people in kids getting in the car, try and meet people on that level, because when we start talking on our level or on our understanding or in using our verbiage, we're not going to be able to communicate properly or have people hear us. And that's what we need, because there is that common truth. We just need to learn how to communicate it better. And to not be, that's why I was saying earlier about moderation, the importance of moderation. People, if you're on two extremes, you're not going to come to the middle and talk to each other. We need to start, and that's kind of how the Federalist Papers started out, talking about the importance of moderation. We have to have moderation, because otherwise, if we're on two separate sides of the issues, we're not going to hear each other. We need to come to the middle and use any common ground we can find. We can find common ground in humanity.
On that note,
I think even the idea, oh, go ahead, Abby.
Oh, that's okay. On that note, I feel like, while certainly there are some areas that, you know, morality, you could say it has declined, that sort of thing, but regardless of where we're coming from and whatever our paradigm is, I think we are less different than it feels. I think we all really want the same things. The difference is that we have a different idea of how to go about accomplishing that and what level of force and government involvement is necessary in order to do that. There are those who say that, you know, we've got to have the government legislating morality, basically, otherwise no one will do it. And then there are those who say, no, they can't legislate it. It is what it is. We have to work on ourselves, right? There have always been extremes, and there always will be, but generally most people really want the same things. They want to be free. They want to make their own choices. They want love and peace and happiness and, you know, all of those things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what we all want. We just have a different understanding of how to go about it and what's effective or not. And going back to education, we're not learning what the founders learned. Our children are learning something different most of the time. And I think that's really it. And morality certainly has declined in some ways, but I think honestly, what we want hasn't changed. We just have these party lines and we stick to them, and we have this knowledge boundary, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I'm going to politely disagree with a couple of fine points there. Generally, I agree with what you're saying. I think that there are still good people. I'll start out first with that, right? There are still good people. I think that generally we do want to have the ability to make choices. Nobody wants to live in communist Russia. Nobody wants to live in communist China, right? We've kind of seen those. But going to the educational component, because we do have such a breakdown in the education, how many people even know what communist China looked like, right? Because if you write it on paper, and I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine at one point, that if you write down a society of consecration and a society of communism, they will look almost identical. And so you can make communism or socialism look really, really appealing. And so this is where I have to disagree a little bit. And that is that I don't even know if we can really have a valid conversation on humanity, as well put as you made that, Leah, that we all have views of humanity. What happens when, aside from protecting life, right? And I'm talking walking talking life, because even you start talking humanity, protecting life with abortion, and suddenly you've got an argument. I'm talking, somebody walks down the street, I walk into somebody, if they just up and shoot me, we can almost all agree across the board that was inhumane. But aside from that, can we really decide what is moral, what is humanity when it comes to marriage and family, when it comes to religion and protecting it, when it comes to any of these issues? Everything's become so politicized, so polarized. It's really hard for me to think that as a country that we can really come together and we can have that conversation, because it goes back to what Tiffany said. That's my truth. That's your truth. Our truths don't match. One of us has to be right. The other one, therefore, must be wrong.
Is it possible then that the government's role is to only touch those things on which we can all agree? I think that's part of the conversation that our country is having. Where is that line, right? And does government try to involve itself in things that ultimately it doesn't need to? That's a hard question to answer, which I think is why we have that conversation, right? We don't all agree. But I feel like there is a line somewhere. And the more we allow government to get involved, the more it will be involved and continue to be involved. So we have to think carefully about what we're willing to let them be a part of in our lives.
So what do we say then to those that are arguing right now very vocally that the government needs to come in and they need to make all things equal? Right? I tell my kids, life's equal, but that doesn't mean it's fair. But everybody wants life to be equal. They want to work at McDonald's and live in a $150,000 house. They want for corporations to pay their fair share of taxes, right? Who decides what are those areas that the government gets to be a part of? Because there are those that are arguing they should be a part of all of it because our system's broken, and that's why we have class warfare, and that's why we have civil rights issues, and that's why we have, you know, all of this stuff that's going on, is because the government's been too uninvolved in what's going on.
The first thing that comes to mind, Tyler, is arguing with a 2-year-old. We're all parents. We know you can't argue with a 2-year-old, right? And and so, I mean, it comes back to, it always comes back to education. I mean, how do we have this, how do we have that discussion with them? You're arguing with a 2-year-old until they can actually educate themselves, until you can have, like, you can't have a conversation with someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, who doesn't know. Now, somebody, this is the thing, is if somebody has done their research and they understand the consequences, they understand history, they understand economics, they understand other countries and cultures and the impact of socialism and what they're saying, and they're for it, I can have a conversation with them because they know what they're talking about at the very least, you know? So that's the problem, is that it comes down to education. How are you going to talk, like, people who are vocally saying these things? They're 2-year-olds throwing a tantrum. They don't know what the heck they're talking about. And so how do you argue with that? You don't. You try to educate other people and encourage other people to seek out, not on your own views, but seek out information. If someone wants to have that conversation with me, you better know that I've kind of fallen back to where, probably because I'm getting old and crabby, I don't know. If someone says something controversial to me, I'll ask them. The first thing I ask them, do you know what you're talking about? In a nice way. If someone asked me something about when the founding fathers, I said, like, I had someone ask me about, a teenager asked me about George Washington. Do you like George Washington? I said, what do you know about George Washington? Well, they didn't really know anything except that he owned slaves. I'm like, why don't you study George Washington? Then we'll have a conversation about it. But pretty much everything, I've kind of taken that approach. Until you know what you're talking about, I'm not having this conversation with you, because otherwise it's falling on deaf ears. I mean, we have to work on educating, not just the education system, which is a mess, but not just education system, but as adults, there's plenty of information out there. We need to start encouraging people to come from a place of knowing what they're talking about. Most of these people, we talked about this earlier today, Brooke, they're going on just their emotions, but until you have some, you're coming as an informed person with an understanding of the topic and the repercussions and the history and again, if you talk about money, like the economics of it, if you don't understand that, then you need to understand that and then match that with your passion and have a conversation. But if you can't do that, how do we have a conversation?
Exactly. Thank you for mentioning that, Leah. I think that's a good point to wrap up this conversation, but I know we could go for hours. But the whole goal of this discussion really is to hopefully inspire others to do what you just said, which is to go get an education, because the only way that we're ever going to dig ourselves out of the hole that we're in right now, and that we're going to be digging deeper into, I foresee in the future, is for each individual and family to be educated, self-educated, not through any government system, but you yourself going and studying the Constitution, studying these Federalist Papers, the arguments for and against, and the Anti-Federalist Papers. And so in closing, I wanted to give some suggested reading to anybody who might be listening too, because as we were going through the discussion, I was like, oh, there's additional books. For instance, when Tyler's mentioning, communist China, what was it like? Well, The Red Scarf Girl is a great book to read to know what it was like there as a youth and what the pattern was that Mao's regime went through in order to enslave their people unknowingly. And it's really helpful for us to read that now to be able to identify patterns that are possibly going on. So The Red Scarf Girl, also Wild Swans, that's a little more mature of a read, but you get the same view. As for Hungary, correct me if I'm wrong, Julia, but Bridget Andau, wasn't that the Hungarian takeover there? That's a great one to read. And also you were talking about, well, Frederick Bastiat, I guess, because he's French. He wrote a couple of great essays, That Which Is Unseen, That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Unseen, and also The Law. And those are some great, because these are not new arguments that we're having or discussions. This is cyclical, and we're in the cycle of history where we're losing freedoms, and these discussions have been had before. So it's helpful to read some of those things and to continue to educate ourselves. So are there any final points that are just burning in anybody that they want to get out before we close?
Could I give one more book? There's one more book, the Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. From what I understand is required reading in Russia. And he asks the question, how did I get here? How did I get in this Gulag? They call it archipelago because it was like a chain of islands, the gulags were, and he found himself in that situation. I haven't gotten through it yet. It was recommended by one of my favorite thinkers. But we need to understand that there's no such thing as your truth. There is the truth, and we all deliberate. And when we all nod in affirmation, we know that we are in unity, because truth, I think it's a part of us, and it resonates with us when we become acquainted with it. And the only advice that I could think of is following, we call him Captain Moroni, but he was a general, so I'll say General Moroni, didn't take his troops out, and neither did Helaman, and say, okay, here's how you strike the head, and here's how you strike the chest, and here's how you wear your armor. And he sat them down and taught them morality through the scriptures. So I think it's similar to what we're doing. We're having a conversation on morality. We're trying to define it. I do like what was said about we need to be careful about nomenclature. We need to try not to speak. That's why I appreciate Benjamin Franklin. We try not to speak in religious tones that aren't going to be understood universally. Use universal terms. Benjamin Franklin, when he was a part of the deliberation in softening up the Declaration of Independence because it was a little too harsh when Jefferson first wrote it, he mentioned a few things. He said that has smacks of the pulpit. We need to reword that. And so I appreciate that, but I don't think we need to shy away from the
core message of what morality is. And maybe there's a debate later for another time on whether or not morality isn't too religious. Maybe it's not too threatening to say, and maybe if we introduce it the right way, maybe it is appealing. I'm just throwing that out there as a question, but I think we need to understand that there's no such thing as your truth. The Oprah Winfrey religion, it's your truth. No, go back to the foundation, 2 Nephi chapter 2, where it's all founded on the foundation of law. And then if there's no law, there's no punishment. If there's no punishment, there's, you know, you guys know, you follow the logic, and it's doctrinally sound.
Okay.
We need to have
And
that
just to
understanding.
clarify too, Derek is referring to the Book of Mormon, and he's referring to those
Oh, I'm
examples
sorry.
in those books. Thank you for sharing. Did anybody else have any other parting comments? And I think I'm going to go through, I'm going to write down these books in the comments on the YouTube channel and on Facebook, the Facebook group, so that people who are listening can just go back and reference those again. All right, well, thank you for this discussion on freedom. I look forward to this next week's readings and joining with you all again.